Thank you, Chuck. This is just some reiteration from last week, but to start out with, turn off or put your cell phones low, so they don't bother the speaker today. Appreciate that. I would like to thank Pastor Kurt Johnson, Board of Directors, and the ushers from the Plymouth Church for hosting this event for the City of Sherrill. We greatly appreciate all you have done to accommodate us. Thank you to tonight's technician, Mike Sherman, and Chuck Bailey. We couldn't do it without you folks. Special thanks go to Craig Crowell. Craig Crowell has amassed 300 three-ring notebooks over in the City of Sherrill. Did a lot of this information, well, except for John's, but everybody before me and after me, we've been going through the City of Sherrill and looking at all the archives there, so thanks to Craig Crowell. Anniversary shirts and t-shirts are for sale at City Hall, if anyone's interested in those. The 100th anniversary cookbook is being sponsored by Friends of the Library. Deadline for submission of recipes is April 30th, real quick. Bring them to the library. The next talk will be May 8th. This will be the format for the evening. We will introduce the speaker who will give his presentation. Please save questions and comments for the end of the evening. Out of respect for the speaker, please hold any conversations or comments until that time. The display board up front has many postcards from Sherrill and the surrounding area. They are courtesy from Linda, Linda's mom. She saved everything that was possible to save. If you don't believe me, ask her. And in the back, Pauline has handouts for United Community Mansion House, and there are free tours to Sherrill and Kenwood residents at the Mansion House when they have their scheduled tours Friday and Saturday. We open on Thursdays yet? Thursday, Friday, and Saturday at 10 and 2, and Sunday at 2 o'clock. So if you live in Sherrill or Kenwood and have never been to the Mansion House, freebie. Take advantage of it. And the next talk will be May 8th on the schools and parks, and Linda will be giving that. At this point, I'll turn it over to Linda.
Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I'd like to say how thrilled I am to see all of you here, but especially children. When we first started this, my idea was to get new people in town, young families, and children who don't know all this history. And most of the people that I saw here last week, we've all been here for a long time and we know a lot of this, but everybody said they learned a lot, so I'm glad to see the children here tonight, so come back again. Our speaker this evening is John Taibi. He is a native of Long Island who has always been fascinated by railroading. After moving to central New York, living in the restored Munnsville Railroad Station, he has researched the history of railroading throughout this region and has authored 13 books and over 100 short stories on that subject. Because Sherrill and Kenwood were somewhat of a railroading crossroads at one time, his visits and explorations here have been many. He lectures extensively on his favorite subject, and his presentation will reveal Sherrill's rail transportation past in an informative and entertaining manner. Do you remember or know about the peanut? If not, his presentation will fill you in on the railroad connection.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Taibi. As Linda said, I'm a native Long Islander. I've lived in this neck of the woods for over 20 years. People say to me, how come I haven't lost my accent yet? That's because I don't want to sound like the rest of you. I want to be an individual. Tonight, we're going to talk about the railroads in Sherrill. We're going to go back to the glory days of railroading transportation in Sherrill during the heyday years of that type of mode of transport on the rails. And to do that effectively, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about Kenwood too, so I hope all you Sherrill residents don't mind me also talking about Kenwood, because they really go part and parcel to the same story. That being said, you might be wondering about the title of my program, The Peanut, the Old Woman, and the Shoe, and how does that fit in with railroading in the Sherrill area? Well, it fits in very nicely, actually. The peanut was the term of endearment for the little trolley car that ran from the West Shore Railroad and the third rail stop in downtown Sherrill, down Sherrill Avenue to the knife plant. And it would make several trips during the course of the day. They charged 5 cents. It would stop at any house along the way to pick people up or drop people off. It was a very accommodating conveyance, and hence the name the Peanut, because in effect it was the smaller version of the electrified third rail system that was operating at that time from Utica to Syracuse. The Old Woman, of course, is the New York, Ontario, and Western, the O&W standing for the Old Woman. And that was the Sherrill, Kenwood area's first railroad. In 1869, the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad built the line across the land of the United Community. And when that was about to take place, John Humphrey Noyes provided land for the station to be built, and you'll see a picture of it in just a minute. But he also said to his group of perfectionists that we have to tidy up our grounds because the world at large will be coming past our door. Well, for those of you that know a little bit about the O&W, I'm not so sure that I know how much of the world came by their door on the O&W, but nevertheless, whoever did go right by the Mansion House, which is where the Peanut went to, because you'll see in the program a picture of the Peanut stopped at the O&W station, which was directly behind the Mansion House. Also, the United Community folks had to move their cemetery to make way for the railroad. And along the way, the railroad was very accommodating. It was sort of, it made for a gateway for the United Community folks because they like to travel willy-nilly to the south and to go up to Oneida Lake where their cottage joppa was. And they would take the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad, which in 1881 became the O&W, or the Old Woman. And that gets us to the shoe. The shoe reflects the name for the electrified third rail system that began life in 1907. It ran on what had been the New York, West Shore, and Buffalo tracks, and it was the first large-scale conversion of a steam railroad for electric service. And because of its unique operation of running with a third rail, which was where the electricity was, they needed to have a way to get the electricity into the car to power the motors to propel the vehicle. And to do that, they had a shoe on the side of the wheel that picked up the electricity. So the third rail line, its nickname became the shoe. So now that you know all about the Peanut, the Old Woman, and the shoe, we'll get on with the program. For those of you that may have come to the first presentation, we have a projectionist up in the balcony, and you'll see me periodically flashing my little red signal up to him to give him the indication to change the slide. And if he doesn't do it effectively, I'm going to shoot him right in the eye. We're going to start off with the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad that was built and began service in 1869. And what you're looking at in the upper picture is a picture of the United Community Station. These were the days before Kenwood, the name Kenwood came into vogue. When the United Community broke up, I believe it was 1879, 1880, they changed the name to their compound to Kenwood. And I'm not so sure anybody has definitively been able to find out how they adopted that name, but some of the folks from the Mansion House told me that they thought it might have come from a camp they had in Europe, where the name Kenwood came from. But on the New York and Oswego Midland, and then the O&W after 1880, they continued to use the name Oneida Community until 1889. So in this picture, we see the signboard. It still says Oneida Community. And that's the station that was built to provide service to the people of the community at that time. And when the railroad first began operation, there was a gentleman at the Mansion House by the name of Newhouse. I think it was Milford J. Newhouse. And he was a sketch artist of note. And he drew several scenes of the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad. And they are amateurish to some degree, but upon reflection, there are elements in his drawings that historians like to see, because it's not very often we get to see such early renditions of railroading at that time, because a lot of times for these early railroads, no pictures survive. So to some degree, we reflect on what was and interpret what was, but it's nice to have drawings like this, because here is a train approaching the United Community Station, and this signboard right here is an early version of a highway crossing sign. Actually, the artist has it turned the wrong way. He's got it that the train goes underneath it, but it should be turned so that the vehicles go underneath it. That was the earliest type of highway grade crossing protection. And I've only seen 2 pictures that show that. And when I saw this drawing, which comes from the Mansion House collection, I says, wow, boy, that's interesting that the detail of an artist, Linda Evans is an artist of note, as you may know. They see these things and their mind is sort of like a camera. A camera looks long and tells all. And a good artist sees these things too and uses them in their artwork. And then we have the gentlemen that are bringing freight over to the station to be shipped to various points. You know, when the New York and Oswego Midland started, the way that the United Community factories would ship their things, they would take everything to the canal at Durhamville. And then, whichever direction it was going, to the west or to New York City, the canal would take their goods to the destination. All of a sudden, the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad came along. They didn't have to go to Durhamville anymore. They could load their stuff right on the train, which connected with all other railroads all around the country. It was a great convenience for them when the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad came, even though they had to move their cemetery to get it there. This is another noteworthy spot in the Kenwood area. This is a bridge number 350. That is all railroads number their bridges consecutively from north to south. So bridge 350, there's 349 of them all the way from New York City. And this stereo card, interestingly, was taken by a photographer from Paterson, New Jersey, but it shows the original New York and Oswego Midland Bridge over the Oneida Creek, which is just to the south of us, almost directly across from the knife plant. And this bridge, of course, was in operation throughout the life of the Oswego Midland in the New York, Ontario, and Western until it was abandoned in 1957. And even though I've been living here and coming to Munnsville since 1969, I never really paid too much attention to the remains of that bridge. But it's one of the few bridges that the stonework has never been improved. And if you go to the spot which is just off the road by the knife plant, especially this time of the year when the leaves are off the trees, you can still see the original New York and Oswego Midland stonework that supported that bridge. And of course that bridge was part of the main line. It saw the passages of many, many trains. And I often wonder, and you can call me an odd person or odd duck or whatever you want to, but one of the reasons that I think people enjoy my books is because I put life back into deceased things. And I give life to inanimate objects, things like railroad stations, wooden buildings. stone bridges. I like to think that, boy, that stone bridge supported the weight of countless trains. If those bridges and depots and buildings could talk, and I'm not so sure they can't, we just haven't learned how to interpret what they say, they could tell us the story. Because here we are today in 2016, the 100th celebration of Sherrill. And in a lot of respects, all of these things that happened years and years ago, we're speculating on some of the things that happened. So when we can see still the real McCoy, this really helps us to interpret what was. There was another noteworthy trestle just below this previous bridge, and this was, of course, Bridge 349. This was the big trestle. And that's the way the folks of the United Community differentiated the one bridge from the other. The little bridge over the United Creek that you've seen in the previous picture, that was the little bridge. But they never referred to it that way. They only called Bridge 349, this bridge, the big bridge. And it was wood initially. That was when the railroad was being built. It was wooden because that expedited the building of the railroad. Later on, they thought they could improve it, and they did, as you'll see in the next slide. But while these bridges were made of wood, there was always a threat for fire. And on a lot of the bridges, they had spaced out on side panels buckets of water, 55-gallon drums of water, so that if a fire should start, because these old steam locomotives, they emit sparks and ash and everything, it was not unusual for trestles to catch fire. And one of the things that the folks of the United Community were particularly aware of was that when the passenger of the train came, they were always on the lookout for a fire on the big trestle. A few years ago, I did a program for the folks at the United Community, and I forget which pictures I used at all, but I wanted to let out the call that happened on one occasion at the Mansion House when a train passed at night and the big trestle did catch fire. I'm going to yell it, but don't everybody rush and get out because there isn't one. Fire! And when they yelled that around the Mansion House, all the men came out, and ladies, because back in those days, men and ladies worked together in that perfectionist community, and they went out with the bucket brigade to save the bridge, and they did. And the bridge that they saved, you can see better in this particular picture on the upper left. That was the wooden trestle before it was improved with steel, which is the picture on the right of one of the southbound Ontario and Western trains crossing it. You can see that if that bridge caught fire, railroad ties and bridge members are all creosoted, it would not take long for an inferno to engulf that entire bridge. But the folks of the United Community, that particular night, they did save it. And as the years wore on, the railroad had to improve all of these things. In some places, they filled in a trestle with earth. This way they wouldn't have to worry about a trestle burning down. And in other cases, they would rebuild it with steel like this one. And for those of you who are particularly sharp-eyed, when you drive south down, I guess it's Sherrill Road, going past the knife plant, just at the end of the parking lot of the knife plant, if you look up on the embankment, you'll see the abutment. This is the abutment for the north end, but the one at the south end that still survives is still there. The Bridge 350 that we saw in the previous scene, that crossed the United Creek, but this bridge crossed over the highway, or the unimproved road at the time, of course, and also a raceway that went into the manufacturing plant of the United Community. For many years, Leon Clifford was the station agent at Kenwood. His given name was Cloyce Clifford. His middle name was Leon, and he never liked when anybody called him Cloyce. Leon was the guy. He was a station agent in Kenwood. I think it was in the area of 39 years. For most of those years, his wife Mabel was his telegraph operator. And back in those days, earlier on, there was no telephone service yet, so everything was via Morse code. Mabel was a qualified telegrapher, and so was Leon. So years later, after I bought the station in Munsville, one of the visitors that came was Leon's son, also named Leon. They had 3 boys. Excuse me, I think the son Leon was the youngest of the 3. And he told me about his father working in the station, and they lived in the station. A lot of the stations on the O&W were not built with living accommodations for the agent and his family, but this one was. It was added on sometime after the New York, Ontario, and Western, the old woman, took over. And he told me about the living rooms upstairs and all, and he told me about how his father would raise chickens and chase the chickens around the front door of the station before the train came so that the passengers wouldn't have chickens to play with. And he also told me about his father being an accomplished trombonist. And on several occasions, when the Sousa band was traveling around the country and they would come to this area, the Sousa band would hire local musicians to fill out the orchestra. And Leon Clifford, he would play with the Sousa band. But the interesting part of his playing the trombone was, of course, anybody that plays any musical instrument, you have to practice sometime. Well, these stations did not have indoor plumbing. They had a water closet or an outhouse on the back property. And his son Leon told me many, many times his father would be in the outhouse with the tuba, not the tuba, the trombone slide going in and out. So he was taking care of business and practicing all at the same time. And isn't it a great thing, after all of these years, to still be able to find out about some of these people that are involved with railroading? After all, railroading is nuts and bolts, and it's steel, and it's locomotives and cars and passenger trains. But if it wasn't for humanity, it's the human element that makes railroading as interesting for me, and I think for a lot of the readers that read what I write. And there's one more story that Leon told me about when they were growing up in the station. His mother and father, both being telegraphers, sometimes they would be sitting around the dinner table, and when the parents didn't want their kids to know what they were talking about, they would tap on the table, and they would talk in Morse code. Well, you would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, how fast kids would learn telegraphy. Kids aren't as stupid then or today like we think they are. They were in on it, and his son Leon said it did not take them very long to learn the Morse code, and after that there was no more Morse code at the table. It was all conversations. This is one of the more notable excursions that ran out of the Kenwood station on the O&W. You know, the O&W was a railroad that endeared itself to all of the communities along the way. It was sort of like the New York Mets in 1969. They lost, so many games, and, the downtrodden people. Everybody supports the underling. Well, the O&W was the underling. They just couldn't seem to do anything right. They had a route that was not competitive with the New York Central. So by the time the 1930s and the 1940s came around, it was a very rare thing to see a passenger train on the O&W. But when there were football games being played at Hamilton, the folks from the United Community Limited at the time, they organized special excursions that they called the Shenango Choo Choo, takeoff on Glenn Miller's tune. And this was one of them on October 26, 1946, and these people are getting ready to ride the train down to Hamilton to see a football game. And I'm not quite sure which teams were playing. I guess Hamilton, of course, Colgate playing somebody. I guess if we went on the internet today, we could find that out relatively easy. But if you look, there is a bulldog here, and this is not Mickey Mouse, this is Minnie Mouse right here. So there must have been some reason that they were having a good time with these animations on the front of the locomotive. And one of the enduring stories of one of the trips was that whenever they went to the football game down at Hamilton, they would always make sure the baggage car was stocked with coolers full of beer just along the way. Well, on one trip on the way back, as they were coming down through the Stockbridge Valley, somehow one of the cars became uncoupled from another car, and the train got broken, and the rear part of the train stopped on the grade. The rest of the train continued on its merry way until everybody on the front part of the train realized, whoa, we lost part of the train. And that maybe is because of that beer that was in those coolers, you couldn't tell. But I think it was for 3 years that they ran the Shenango Choo Choo. The first one was just before World War II, and the second two were the years after World War II. During World War II, there was no Shenango Choo Choos at all. This is the New York West Shore and Buffalo Railroad, which became the West Shore Railroad when the New York Central acquired it in 1886. This was Sherrill's first railroad. When the New York West Shore and Buffalo was being built, it crossed right along in front of the main plant of the United Community Limited. This was the main line railroad for the future city of Sherrill. And it was completed and opened initially October 1st, 1883. This particular scene shows a train coming along at Adams Crossing, which today we know as High Bridge. It's where the Shenandoah Stone is, and the milk plant is right along Route 5. That's where this picture was taken from, where High Bridge had actually been a bridge at one time. Today, it's filled in, so it's not a bridge anymore, but back then, the photographer was standing right there. This is the unimproved Seneca Turnpike, which is today's Route 5, and this fellow right here, I can never figure out why he's standing in the middle of the track while this train is coming along, but nevertheless, there he is, and I'm glad to see that at least he stopped before he proceeded in front of that train. Well, this is the railroad that built through the future city of Sherrill, but for some reason or other, they never built a depot here. There was never a station on the West Shore Railroad for Sherrill. It's somewhat surprising because, after all, such a big industrial concern as the United Community Limited was right there. Why wouldn't they think that there would be a need for shipping services there? I don't know why that is, but they never built a station. They built a station at Vernon. That building is still surviving. And then, of course, they built a station at Oneida Castle. Actually, it's on the west side of the Oneida Creek. It's actually in Oneida. And that was where they crossed the O&W. But Sherrill never had a railroad station. And I'm going to get to a building a little later on that you're probably thinking, well, that building was a station, but I'll tell you right now it wasn't. But we'll see that in just a minute. So when the New York Central acquired the New York West Shore and Buffalo Railway, they had no need for it. They needed it like a hole in the head. All they wanted to do was acquire it to get rid of the competition. Well, by the early 1900s, right about the time this church was being built, some folks from Cleveland, Ohio came along and got together with the important officers of the New York Central Railroad And they decided that it's time to do something with this portion of the West Shore Railroad. They wanted to electrify it between Utica and Syracuse initially, and they were hoping eventually to be able to electrify east of Utica and west of Syracuse. So that by 1907, this new electrified third rail system got its start. This was the first large-scale conversion of a steam railroad, steam meaning steam locomotive, the first large-scale conversion of a steam locomotive-operated railroad for electric services. A couple of slides ahead of myself, I just want to show you this picture of the Oneida Limited plant. And this gives you a good perspective of where the West Shore tracks were in relation to this and the community of Sherrill. And why there was no station built, I don't know, but there never was one. And today, when you're driving up and you come up to the traffic light where the save-on is, look beyond where the abandoned structure is that had been the main plant for the Oneida Limited. This is the bridge that used to be there. Along the way, when the railroads were being built, we have to remember that the highway wasn't the way it was today then. Route 5 did not go straight along the south side of the railroad. In other words, in this picture, this is Route 5, but this picture was taken after 1929 when Route 5 was realigned. Route 5, the Seneca Turnpike, used to be this road, and it would go underneath the bridge and go along the south side of the railroad to do Ross Crossing, then go underneath the railroad again to the north side of the railroad, and then cross the railroad to the south once again on High Bridge. That's the way Route 5 was. But by 1929, the state of New York streamlined all that and built Route 5 as we know it today. Well, when they did that, there was a little triangle piece of land that lied between where the old Route 5 was and the new Route 5. And the folks at the Oneida Community Limited decided that would be a great place for us to build our community plate showroom. And they did. They built it there. And that's the building right there. That's the building that was built on that triangular piece of land. By the time this illustration was done, they already had added a gas station there. But this building, which is today's, is owned by the Crane Company, that building that many of you and many other people think had been the railroad station, it was never a railroad station. As a matter of fact, the people in the Crane building think that it housed people that were going to ride the electrified third rail, but that isn't correct either. That building was built as a showroom for the Oneida Community Limited's copper plate, which was a product line of theirs. And in this particular picture, you can see the West Shore Railroad running along behind the building. And that's that place right there. So when you drive past there on your way east or west or north or south, that is a little bit of an historic spot there that reflects the change of not only the railroading past, but also the highways past as well. We're up on top of that bridge that Route 5 used to go underneath, and we're looking towards the west at an approaching third rail trolley car that's coming up to the Sherrill station. When the third rail began operation in June of 1907, that is when Sherrill received its first railroad station. Of course, it wasn't a traditional station, it was a glorified shelter. There was this more ornate building on the north side of the tracks, and on the south side of the tracks, you'll see in a minute, was another smaller building. And this was one of the artwork drawings that was done as a logo for the railroad. In this particular picture, you can see the third rail. What do I mean by the third rail? Railroad tracks have two rails. You need two rails to ride on. Well, the third rail is the rail that the electricity is being carried in. And that's why they need the shoe on the car to pick up the electricity from that third rail. The shoe rode underneath the bottom of the third rail. It was what they called the underrunning third rail system. And that shoe allowed the electricity to flow from the third rail into the shoe and into the electrical motors on the third rail cars. And that was how these cars were propelled. You could ride along, they were, top speed was 52 miles an hour. If they were going downhill on Vernon Grade or Canastota Hill, they could hit 60 miles an hour. Imagine that! In 1907, 60 miles an hour in an interurban car. That's pretty damn good. Especially when you're riding alongside the unimproved Seneca Turnpike like we saw in the previous picture, with some old jalopy stuck in the mud in the spring and you're cruising along at 60 miles an hour. That was why the electrified third rail system that ran through Sherrill and provided Sherrill's first station was such a well-received operation right from the very beginning. Excuse me. How successful was it, you might ask? Does anybody? It was very successful. For the month of July 1906, the New York Central Railroad tabulated that on its steam railroads between Utica and Syracuse on both the main line and the West Shore, they carried 11,000 people in that 1 month, July 1906. For the first full month of the electrified third rail operation, a year later, July 1907, the electrified third rail carried over 112,000 people. It was embraced by the public immediately. It was so popular because it allowed people from outlying locations to travel to the city for shopping, for visiting, even for working. People could leave Sherrill and go to Syracuse or Utica and work for the day and come home at night. That was unheard of. And who was the genius that developed all of this? It was a fellow by the name of Frank Sprague. He is one of America's forgotten inventors. He was a contemporary of George Westinghouse and Edison and all these others, Bell, that we know and talk about much more, but nobody knows of Frank Sprague and all of these electrical inventions that are still being used on today's modern railroads were all developed by him. This is another view of the electrified third rail, and you get a little bit better view of the third rail right here. Here is the building we saw in the previous picture, and this is the other shelter on the other side. In this upper picture, this was the freight station. The electrified third rail not only operated passenger service, that you could ride from downtown Utica to downtown Syracuse in an hour. You try doing that in your car today. Downtown Utica to downtown Utica, that's Bag Square to Clinton Square. Can you do that in an hour? I'm not so sure you can, but they were doing it back then. But the electrified third rail also operated a package service. And the express car would stop here, and then they would wheel shipments up and down this ramp to effect delivery or pickup. Back in these days, between 1907 and 1930, when the third rail was in operation, these express cars, you could send something from Utica or Syracuse or several points in between so that people could get it the same day. Imagine that. FedEx and the post office and all DHL and all these other companies, they don't have a hat to hang anything on because the electrified third rail was doing it even back then. It was a very innovative system. And this is another view of the West Shore Railroad. These pictures were taken after the abandonment of the third rail system, and they show the relationship of the railroad to the main plant, and in this case, the trap shop. There was a siding that came off of the main line that went down to the ground level so that the United Community Limited could ship out or receive their goods right from boxcars, which I think we're going to see in this next scene. This boxcar right here is on that siding, and you can see it's below grade where the station is. For those of you that are sitting close, and maybe even you folks sitting in the back, can you read what that sign says right there on the car? It says Oneida. That's right. Why do you think that is? Here's an operation that ran between Utica and Syracuse, yet that car says Oneida. One of the things that the third rail system had to accomplish to affect their franchise with the cities of Utica, Oneida, and Syracuse was to develop a transportation system for people who work at the Oneida Community Limited. And they did that by operating 3 round-trip trains a day in the morning from Oneida to Vernon through Sherrill, and then in the evening they would operate 3 trains again from Vernon to Oneida, back and forth. And they called those trains the Working Man Special. The workers could get to the plant. It cost 25 cents for them to do that, and they could ride the train from the outlying places to go to work at the United Community Limited. And of course, back in those days, you know, we tend to forget today how easy it is for us to travel. We're getting now a car. Cars are very reliable today. You turn the key, they actually start. Back in those days, not everybody had cars. People couldn't afford cars. People didn't want cars. People still wanted to have horses. But to get to work, they had to do that. They rode the electrified third rail in the Working Man Specials. And that's why that car has a sign that says Oneida, because it's going back to Oneida to pick up more workers to bring to Sherrill, where this train is stopped at right now. This is the other shelter that's on the eastbound side of the track. And in this scene, we see a view from the north side of the bridge. This is Route 5 going underneath the bridge. Here is the one shelter, here is the other, and you might see that the shelter has changed. This shelter on the right is not the one that we saw in the previous picture, which tells me this isn't really the picture. And here's folks getting off the car, and they're coming down this staircase to come down to either go to work, or businessmen that were salesmen going to the United Community Limited to sell the company their wares. This was not a handicapped accessible operation. Back in those days, there was no decree to have everything with handicapped ramps and everything else. And as you can see, when you rode the electrified third rail, you better be a hardy person to get up and down the stairs at many of the stops. Just east of Sherrill was a place called Morrison's Crossing. Morrison's Crossing was where the railroad crossed Route 5, much like we saw at Sherrill, where the railroad crossed over Route 5, and then at Due Ross Crossing, and then at High Bridge Crossing. That was the way Route 5 crossed back and forth. And this was Morrison's Crossing right here. And this is the unimproved highway. And this was where stop 18 was. I should have previously mentioned Sherrill was stop 19. All the stops were numbered sequentially from Utica to Syracuse. So the lower the number, the closer you were to Utica. The higher the number, the closer you were to Syracuse. Sherrill was right about in the middle because there were 40 stops and Sherrill was number 19. But at stop 18, this was the car, one of the cars stopped at the Morrison's Crossing stop. And in this scene, this is a panorama picture that they took a lot of times in the old days that was, that's still in the collection of Dr. Pickles. And Dr. Pickles lives today in this house right here, which is where Morrison Crossing was at one time. But today, I guess they call it East Seneca Turnpike, ends at Dr. Pickle's house because it no longer crosses the railroad. First of all, the railroad isn't there, but even if it was, it still wouldn't cross it because Route 5 is constantly on the south side of the railroad. And this little building right here in the distance, we're going to get a better look at it a little later on. That's the old power station. It was the Vernon Power Station. They called it Vernon Station number 2, even though it was actually closer to Sherrill. At stop 19 at Sherrill was where the peanut met the shoe. This is the peanut, and this is the shoe up on the hill. We've seen, again, not handicapped accessible. The peanut had a small trolley car. What's the difference between a trolley car and an interurban car? Well, size is one thing, but the service is really the determining factor. A trolley car is a vehicle that provides local service around the community, where an interurban car provides high-speed service between urban areas, which is what the electrified third rail did between Utica and Syracuse. So the peanut, this is where its northern part of the line was. People would get off the shoe, come down the stairs, walk over to the peanut, and the peanut would take them down to the administrative offices along Sherrill Road or down to the knife plant. And the peanut, the rails for the peanut were right along the east side of Sherrill Road and Kenwood Avenue, right along the whole way. It just went along. That was why it was easy for people to get on the peanut or get off, and it stopped wherever you wanted. And the cost of riding it was a nickel. There was a period of time when the railroad thought, well, boy, we got to try to raise the rates and make a little bit more money because times were bad, and they tried to raise the price to 7 cents. There was such a hullabaloo. Nobody rode the cars until they lowered it back down to a nickel. And then everything was hunky-dory. There used to be, 15 years or so ago, some elderly folks at the Mansion House who were still very put out over the fact that they really wanted to have to pay 7 cents for the peanut. That was ridiculous. But where the Save-On station is today is where the car barn was for the peanut. So when you go into the Save-On, that was where the car barn was. And this is the crew for the peanut. They're posed probably on the same day right here. I don't remember the names of the fellows. I think the conductor was Bill Lawrence, but I don't remember the name of the motorman. And the interesting thing about the peanut, it's more commonly called the Sherrill-Kenwood trolley because that's what it did. It went from Sherrill to Kenwood. But its official name was the Kenwood extension of the United Third Rail System. But to everybody around here, it was the peanut. And it was not physically connected to the third rail. Whenever the car in use on the peanut broke down or they had to change it out for servicing, they had to build a ramp. The track went through the car barn, and then back where the snowplow is, they would build a ramp that went up to the electrified third rail, and then they jacked the car over and then bring it down. Consequently, they only shipped cars that they thought were really robust and in good condition so that they wouldn't have to do that very frequently. This is the peanut coming up from Kenwood, and this is Sherrill Road right here. I just came up right through here the other day, and I'm sure all of you do all the time. You could drive up and down willy-nilly and probably never pay any attention to the fact that right next to the road on the west side, there is some utility piping. And that utility piping utilizes the abutments for the old peanut line. And this picture is one of the particularly nice ones. This is the Mansion House compound in the background here. This picture was taken at the exact same place as the previous picture, but we're looking north rather than looking south. And the trolley is stopped right on the bridge over Oneida Creek, and here is the road bridge right here. On this particular day, they're advertising something going on at Kenwood Park. Oh, it's a baseball game, yeah, just across the top of it. And this car 168 was the one that probably was in the longest service in operation on the Peanut. The Peanut met the old woman at Kenwood. This is the Peanut, and there's the O&W station behind it that we saw previously. Just behind the photographer, there was a walkway that led right over to the mansion house. So it was convenient for people in the early days, the perfectionists, to get over to the train, to ride to Joppa on Oneida Lake, or to ride to any other point they wanted to go. And this particular picture on the lower side was given to me by Leon Clifford, who I talked about earlier. This is the O&W station, and this is the Peanut Shelter right here. And this picture also shows, of course, a southbound O&W train starting. And finally, the southern terminus of the Peanut was at the knife plant, and we know this picture was taken at the knife plant because there is the building right there, right underneath the fender. They called this the fender, and the purpose of those was somewhat like a cow catcher on a steam locomotive. They were built low enough so that if somebody stepped in front of the car, that thing would pick them up and drop them down into it rather than squash them or electrify them. And this was only a single truck car, so there was a lot of waddling back and forth and dancing around, but nevertheless, for the speed the Peanut traveled, it did not travel at 50 miles an hour like the third rail cars. It just trundled along at maybe 5 or 10 miles an hour. After the Peanut ceased operation in 1929, a fellow by the name of Adolphe Napoleon Bonaparte Montigny, does anybody know him? Okay, you have to be, okay, well, you're showing your age a little bit by raising your hand. But he bought the shelter and he moved it to his house not far off of Route 46 on your way down between Oneida Castle and Lunsville. Well, anyway, he's the fellow that purchased that building, and I think there is still a garage down next to his old house that was built around that, so in some respects, it's still in operation. By the time 1957 came around, the New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad, the beloved O&W, had become a thing of the past. It had been in receivership since 1937. It was only because of World War II that it survived into the 1950s. It abandoned on March 29, 1957, and the following summer, during August of 1958, the tracks were being taken up through the Kenwood area. There were people around that were little kids when the railroad was built and began operation in 1869. And of course, by 1957 and 58, they were elderly. Isn't it something that they witnessed the coming of the railroad, something that they never thought they'd see, something that puts the canal out of business? It was such a glorious thing to have a railroad. Oh my God, we can travel wherever we want. We're connected with the outside world, or as John Humphrey Noyes said, the world will be coming by our door because of the train. Then, 90 some odd years later, they're still alive to see the railroad being abandoned. What a terrible thought. Today, sometimes we don't take consideration of these things that are passing, and all of a sudden they're gone, and for us, life goes on. But sometimes we should take more of a point of noticing the passing of these certain things, just like with what they're attempting to do with the Adirondack, a line going to Lake Placid, where the state wants to abandon the section between Tupper Lake and Lake Placid. I mean, we're witnessing the abandonment of a vibrant railroad. If the state does that, it would be the first time that an active railroad is abandoned specifically to become a trail. Normally, a trail is made because a railroad has abandoned, but not in this particular case. So we have to be aware of all these different things. And just look at this gentleman right here. He's standing there contemplating them taking up the tracks. Where that scrap train went, no trains could follow. That was the end of the line. I tell in my books, when that train passed, the sounds of railroading went with it. All of us that like to think of listening to the wail of a steam locomotive in the distance, or today hear the CSX trains blowing for the crossings at Sand Hill Road and out that way. It's a nice, pleasant sound because you know Americans were born to like railroading. To some degree, Stephen Ambrose tells us, because it's inbred in us to know that railroading is what made our country great. And he's right. So to some degree, you all like railroading. Maybe you like to have a model train going around the Christmas tree. Maybe you like to sit beside the tracks to watch trains or count the cars as they go by. To some degree, you like railroading because you're an American, and by God, you know railroading made this country great. My degree is stronger than yours, but I've got you right where I want you. I told you in that panoramic picture taken at Morrison's Crossing, we'd see the power station a little close up, and this is it. This is power substation number 2 at Vernon. Actually, it's Sherrill. And that picture was taken after the third rail line abandoned on December 31st, 1930. Isn't it an amazing thing with railroads? They made our country great, but along the way, they made it possible for the people to change their attitudes about transportation. So what they needed at one time, 30 years later, they didn't necessarily need it, and it was abandoned. What was so popular at one time, all of a sudden became a thing of the past because we decided we like our own personal transportation. We can get in our own car whenever we want, go wherever we want to go. We don't have to rely on the schedule of a train to hold us back. We don't need the train to take us anywhere anymore. We can go whenever we want. And that was why these railroads were abandoned. Eventually, the city of Sherrill purchased the building, I think it was for $4,000, and they used it as an incinerator. And that was why it got its smokestack here. You can see in the earlier picture there's no smokestack. When it became an incinerator for Sherrill, that was when that brick structure was put on. And for years we drove by that building along the side of Route 5, and a lot of us might not have known what it was, but boy, it was a great place to look at. And every time you drove by, oh yeah, there it is, there's that building. I don't know what it was for, but boy, that's a great building. And we drove by every time and we pointed out to other people. Some of you knew that it was the power substation that provided the electricity for the electrified third rail system. Most of you didn't, but everybody liked seeing that building. It became an iconic structure along the line of Route 5, something that we looked for. All of a sudden, one day it was gone. What happened? Well, it had been the property of the United Indian Nation. They owned it and they used it for the offices for a period of time until the casino got started, and then the offices would move there, and then it languished for a while. Then the nation decided that they're going to refurbish it and they're going to use it as a video studio. For those of us that drove along Route 5, we'd look at the face of it. It looked like it was in good condition, and it was. It was a robust building. It was made of brick and steel, built to last the ages. A company from Utica built all 4 of the power substations, and it endured forever. But unbeknownst to us driving along Route 5, the back side of the building was where all the bricks were falling off. So the nation had an engineering company come in to assess the quality of the building for them to refurbish for this video studio. And the engineering company said that it would cost a little over $1 million just to stabilize the building. And with that, the Indians decided, well, we're going to knock it down because for $1 million we can build a brand new building. Much like any of us that buy anything, if we can build something better to our benefit rather than spending all the money, we might decide to raise the building too. It was a shame that it happened because we all liked it and we thought of it and we looked for it all the time, but in practicality it was a building that had to come down. Very unfortunate. I'm not so sure it would have cost a little over $1 million to do that. I think sometimes these engineering firms, they really mark up the price. Nevertheless, the Indians decided to do it, and in a couple of days, the entire building was knocked down. But when you drive by Route 5 today and you see that patch of land where the building used to be, and you might say to yourself, oh boy, look at the building is gone. Maybe now, after the passage of a couple of years, you might drive by and forget where it was. But if you remember, the soul of these buildings will come back so that you can still see the ghost of them sitting there as proudly as they used to be years ago when the heyday years of the electrified third rail was in operation and they were providing the power to do what they were made to do. The ghosts of these buildings, just like with people, and I'm a firm believer in the afterlife, and people that know a lot more about that than I do tell me that we have loved ones looking over our shoulder more than we care to think. And I hope that's true, because when I use a tool of my father's, or I use one of my mother's black frying pans, I always say, gee, thanks, Mom, or thanks, Dad, that really worked out swell. So if they're looking over my shoulder, I'm thankful. Look over the shoulder of the building of the electrified third rail system, because it would appreciate you remembering it as well. Finally, I think we have maybe one more slide after this one, or maybe this is the last one. Who would like to be able to run after the train like Mr. Peanut is doing that, to ride a train again? If the Peanut was running every day, it would compete with us driving up and down Sherrill Road, but just for the heck of it, wouldn't you get on the Peanut once in a while? If you could ride from Sherrill to Utica or to Syracuse, for shopping, for visiting, or for whatever reason, in a speedy way on the electrified third rail, wouldn't you do that? Of course you would. If the O&W was still around, would you ride the O&W? Probably not, because it was the slowest way to get anywhere. And one of the stories about the president of Hamilton College in Clinton was asked by a prospective student one time that he wanted to go to Hamilton College in the worst way. And the president told him, go by the O&W. We always make fun of the things we hold dearest. And the O&W was that type of railroad. We held it dear, and we still miss it, and we remember it well.